Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to our webinar on the 15-minute neighbourhood. I'm really delighted that so many have been able to join us this lunchtime. Now, the 15-minute city on neighbourhood is a concept that's been around for quite a while. And like a lot of things from the last year with COVID, it's accelerated what we want to do it. So the real question is, how do we plan and develop and adapt cities and neighbourhoods to the way that we should be living and working and caring and having fun, rather than us trying to adapt to a much larger city? So how do we make the best use of the space and facilities that we've got so that we all can benefit from it, not just the comfortable middle classes, which there is a concern about. Now, there are so many elements to the 15-minute neighbourhood that we could have millions of webinars on it. So we're going to touch on actually four things, the very different aspects. And first, we're going to hear from Alba Menendez, who is a senior consultant at Arup. Then Tom Titherington, who's the Executive Director of Development and Commercial, such a long title, Tom, at Sovereign Housing Association, followed by Hussain, who's the Executive Director of Plates from the Royal Borough of Kingston, and finally Kaye, who's a CT Associate Consultant specialising in development and property. So I'm going to start with Alba. As I said, Alba is a senior consultant with Arup. She specialises on transport and mobility issues, and she's going to be sharing some data from some international surveys that have impacted on and shown impact on working from home, the transport opportunities and challenges, and some other things as well. Possibly coffee might come into it. Alba, over to you.
Thanks, Maggie. Can you see my screen? Yeah? Great. So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Maggie. I'm Alba Menendez, as Maggie said, a senior transport consultant with Arup in Dublin office. And today I'll be covering the concept of the 15-minute neighbourhood from the transport perspective. So what are the challenges, the opportunities, and I'll cover briefly also some data insights about the potential future of working from home and how this trend align with the concept we are reviewing today. So first, I'd like you all to think how a normal working day in your life was just a year ago. If we all go back to, let's say, January 2020, none of us could have ever imagined that our routines, our habits, and even our priorities would change so much in such a short time, right? So this COVID-19 has completely changed the way we work, the way we shop, the way we socialized. It made some of us, particularly those working from home, realize that our homes are not big enough to live and work from them. It also made us rediscover our own neighborhoods, some fantastic local shops, bars and restaurants that we have never seen before. It has even made some of us to start cycling, skating, walking, running, and even buying a bike for the first time. But also, on the other hand, it has made some of us realize, particularly the ones who have been working from home, that we don't have everything we need within a 10 or even a 15-minute walk from our house. And well, probably all this concept of proximity, one of the main, let's say, foundations of the 15-minute neighborhood idea we're going to be discussing today, wasn't so important for us before the COVID era, when most of us saw our homes just as our resting place after a long day working in the office. But as I said, this pandemic has completely changed our expectations, our priorities, and it has accelerated several trends such as remote working that will most likely stay with us in the future new normal. So what is the magnitude of the potential future changes? Over the last few months in Arup, we've been looking across the world, but more closely across Europe, to try to understand how the COVID-19 has accelerated some trends and the potential for this to stay. So as you can see in the slide, before the pandemic, working from home was already but slowly gaining ground with digitalization. And just to give you a few examples based on data from a Eurofund survey in this case, in countries such as Ireland, Spain, or Italy, the percentage of people who were able to work from home in 2019 on a regular basis was around 7%. Then the COVID started, and due to the restrictions, a huge percentage of people, basically everyone who could, was forced to work from home. Just to give you some numbers, the percentage of people who could work from home in these countries in June 2020 was between the 50 and 60%. I think in the UK was in this range as well. And that's a 600% increase in Ireland and almost a 700% increase in Italy of people that for now a quite important number of months have completely forgotten about commuting, have changed their routines, at least for a few days per week, and have rebuilt their lives around their home place. Obviously, we've been in an exceptional situation that has forced these numbers to be so high. But the question now is, how many of these people who can perform their duties from home at least some time per week will continue doing so? So survey after survey, we found out that the COVID has really accelerated the expectations of employees to be able to work from home. And our surveys that are actually pretty consistent with other external international surveys we've checked show that around 70% of office workers would like to work at least sometime from home, with a clear preference of 2-3 days per week. And if we imagine, for instance, a purely commuter town where people were taking the train or driving to work from 7 in the morning to 7 in the evening, towns that were basically empty during all day, what would happen if a percentage of their residents could be now able to work from home? So these towns may become vibrant, may become interesting. There could be better opportunities for local business to open, bringing the formal local employment, and also more opportunities to reactivate the local economy. And all this trend seems to be pointing us away from the standard single center approach and to focus more on a, let's say, a polycentric approach. And well, this doesn't mean that we need to move to a suburban way of life, but we may need to move perhaps to a more, let's say, network of neighborhood centers, well connected, that can operate together, creating economies between them, and that don't necessarily rely on the kind of central hub we are used to. And obviously, all these new trends and this recalibration of work, life, and place will have huge impacts on transport and will bring to the table several huge opportunities to develop these 15-minute neighborhoods, but also big challenges that we will need to take into account when we're thinking the urban environment. So as I said earlier, the 15-minute neighborhood is based on proximity. So this could mean an increase in short trips that are perfect for walking or cycling, which is great. And in the same way, the concept of proximity is important, attractiveness is key, particularly when we want people to make the sustainable choice, right? So you may have a supermarket 10 minutes walking from your house, but you have to cross several congested roads. The footpaths are narrow. It is pretty dark during the winter. And I mean, you have a perfect road and tons of parking to go there in just 2 minutes. Why not take the car, right? However, if you have some local shops, let's say in a pedestrianized area where you can walk while checking other shops, have a takeaway coffee, meet with some friends, maybe you prefer to buy some fresh food there at least a few times per week and just leave the car trip for a big shopping just once a week. And basically, this is how it works with model choice. If neighborhoods are vibrant, are full of shops and services, safe, and are well connected with high quality infrastructure and so on, it is more likely that people stay local and walk or cycle to these services. Otherwise, people will just go somewhere else or will just use the car. And again, this pandemic has been a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to try temporary solutions to easily test public acceptance or to accelerate great projects that have been stopped for years. And in this sense, tactical urbanism has proved to be a very powerful tool to find quick and low-cost solutions during the last year. So there are thousands of examples around the world, but I just wanted to show a few of them. The first one here is from Dublin, a cycle lane that had been planned for 20 years and that was built in just 4 weeks during the COVID. Great public acceptance, people love it, even though it meant removing one lane for cars, and it has triggered the development of others around the city. The next one here are the parklets in Milan and Liverpool. Not only great for minimizing the COVID risk, but also to make the streets and neighborhoods vibrant and obviously to support the local businesses. And finally, the pedestrianization of streets, in this case in Dublin, but there are many projects that were going to be temporary that now are going to become permanent in Barcelona and Madrid, for instance. So in terms of road traffic in several cities such as Dublin, for instance, the private car is still the preferred mode for commuting. We have around 65%, so it is quite considerable. So if in the future we have a percentage of people working from home, there may be an opportunity to reduce traffic, particularly at peaks in several roads, which may involve a reduction in commuting time, noise, pollution, accidents, and so on. However, we need to be very careful with this assumption, excuse me, as this initial reduction in congestion and increased availability of road space and parking space may attract more users, particularly from public transport, as suddenly, excuse me, the car may become more convenient. Besides, some people working from home may decide to move farther away from the city center to a bigger house or nicer neighborhood. And instead of walking or cycling or taking the metro 5 days a week, they may prefer to go by car the 2 days that they need to attend the office. And I just wanted to show you a picture that I really like from my hometown, Madrid, of the Paseo de la Castellana, one of the main streets in the capital, both pre-COVID on the left-hand side and during the COVID lockdowns in April, when it became temporarily pedestrianized. And this is just to show how the infrastructure in cities is usually filled, similarly, I'd say, to gas. So you put more lanes in this road, and you'll most likely have them as congested as in the picture in a couple of months. Or you allow people to use it, and then you have it filled with people walking, cycling, skating, playing, or whatever. And finally, I'd like to briefly cover the challenges and opportunities for public transport. I like to highlight that this 15-minute neighborhood concept is a complementary approach to transit-oriented developments. I mean, the one that promotes denser mixed-use developments around public transport services. So even in a perfectly well-designed 15-minute neighborhood, it is essential to provide fast, frequent, and reliable public transport connections to other neighborhoods and centers, especially of work. So particularly those who have no access to a car can access to jobs, friends, family, entertainment, and so on in other parts of the cities. So in several cities, particularly large and dense urban areas, public transport is one of the most popular modes for commuting. So similarly to what I said before for the car, and increasing the remote working rates may imply a reduction in peak demand. So several routes, particularly those serving business districts, may have fluctuating demand or demand patterns to the different times of the day and the different days of the week. And I say that the main challenge here is that if services become unreliable due to this unpredictable volatility, commuters may prefer to switch to other modes such as private cars. And the problem is that not everyone may have that choice. So this may increase inequalities if the quality of the service decreases. But on the positive side, despite these challenges, there are also several opportunities to optimize public transport and flatten the so-called demand curve. Being able to, let's say, for instance, distribute more evenly the services during the day, which will allow authorities and operators to optimize the fleet, to optimize maintenance, scheduling, and to make the services more reliable and attractive throughout the day, particularly for those, as I said, who have no choice. So that's all from my side, Maggie.
Thanks very much, Alba. Listen, one of the questions that's come up actually, because this is very much 15-minute neighbourhood stemmed from the 15-minute city, but we were asked prior to the webinar starting, and there's also a question now from Jackie Bryson, is what about, are these kind of issues and concepts applicable to semi-rural areas or the countryside? And I don't know whether any of your work has actually linked. I mean, there's a certain amount where you're talking about the links between the public transport and getting between places. But has any work been done in Arup on sort of semi-rural places?
Not to rural, more to commuter cities or commuter towns, close to main towns, where obviously people live and then they commute into the city. So obviously all what I said applies to these kind of places. But if you have a rural area with a village and everyone from that village just live there and commute there, then I guess it's much easier than having the requirement for people to move 1 hour or 1 hour and a half or whatever to work. And that's where you may have these inequalities.
Okay, thanks. Tom, have you got anything to add to that in terms of the scope that Sovereign covers? You don't have to.
I think the thing with that question, I think that's a really good question, and I am going to try and touch on that when I do my presentation. But it's quite interesting to think about when we tend to think about a country like Holland. We tend to think about it being kind of a series of cities, urban, with bicycle lanes and everything else. But what they've actually got is really good cycle connectivity between a series of villages. And I think if you go into kind of rural and semi-rural areas in the UK, to actually kind of walk between settlements or cycle between settlements is quite difficult. So I do think there's something about the concept which you can apply to the rural and the semi-rural in terms of thinking through different forms of connectivity rather than just the car. Okay. So I think it is something where concepts can be applied more broadly.
Okay, right. So Naz is the Executive Director of Place for Royal Borough of Kingston, which is an up-and-coming outer London borough, and she's going to be talking about the opportunities that the 15-minute neighbourhood has got for Kingston. Thanks.
Thank you, Maggie. And colleagues will be delighted to say I'm not doing slides, so hopefully I shouldn't have any technical glitches. And whilst Maggie says we're up and coming, I'd like to say we've already arrived, Maggie, in Kingston. But thank you, really delighted to be here this afternoon. The emergence of the 15-minute neighbourhood approaches have to date in other parts that globally really developed really organically, and I think that's something we need to bear in mind. It's either been through really clear policy interventions or planning mechanisms. And we must also remember that many of these cities have got a bit of a spatial advantage on us because that's how they were originally planned and developed. However, given where we are in the middle of a global pandemic, it's really, really important that we think about the 15-minute neighbourhood within the wider macroeconomic climate that we find ourselves in. 15-minute neighbourhoods must be seen in the fundamental changes and set within the context that we are now seeing. It will take decades to reverse the deeper deprivation, unemployment, and of course, the public health impacts that many, many people are now facing. And it is within this context that I'd like to talk to you about what we want to do. So as you'll all be aware, we are seeing the biggest contraction in GDP in over 300 years. And London has already been lagging behind in terms of productivity and output. If you compare us in terms of relative cost and price, in terms of globalization, and of course, our recent departure from Europe, makes it a really challenging place to be thinking about these kinds of new ways in which we might reorganize the way that we work and live and socialize. My own borough, Kingston, sits within South London, hugely affluent, with very, very high levels of qualified residents that have been commuting into central London for many decades. As a sub-region, our GVA was already that behind London and globally. And therefore, whilst we are starting to think about this concept of 15-minute neighbourhoods, what we're also recognising in our sub-region is that by 2021, we will have lost 20,000 jobs. And you cannot think about one without the other. However, there are many, many benefits to the 15-minute neighbourhood. And Alba's colleagues at Arup recently did some work around major cities globally, like Madrid and Paris and New York, and concluded that on average, London is actually a 23.5-minute city. As I've mentioned, the concept has real resonance for us. And in Kingston and in South London, we are already thinking about the concept of a hubbub. We want kind of outer London to be a place where you can afford to live and work and raise your family in a really good quality environment, because clearly this brings benefits, whether that's bringing better daytime spending power to our local economy, whether that's reducing congestion, as Alba's talked about, and the environmental damage that that brings with it. But also, as we all know, it has given us an opportunity to think about maybe not a better work-life balance at the moment, But, you know, absolutely about rethinking our priorities and, of course, absolutely using our green spaces. The concept of 15-minute neighbourhoods takes us away from a zoning approach to planning and development to one that is much more, as I like to call, a mosaic approach to development and neighbourhoods. And that's really where we want to move to. And essentially, it moves the city from being focused on simply economic productivity and the associated commuting and spend, etc., that's linked to that, to recognising that people are losing really useful time. And 15 minutes neighbourhoods is about regaining that time back. From all the research that I've done, well-planned 15-minute neighbourhoods will be places that carry out 6 really important social functions: living, working, supplying, caring, learning and enjoying. And what I'd like to do very briefly is untouch each of those elements and talk about what we actually really practically need to do in terms of policy interventions to make this a reality, and some of the challenges that we face in this global city. So starting off with living and working. If we are to recognise that living and working can only really coexist if jobs are much more agile and flexible, that requires a fundamental shift in whole industries across our capital. It requires us to reshape what we do and how we do it. And that will require really, really strong leadership right across the public and private sector. As already been alluded to, blue-collar workers don't have the luxury of working from home. And recently talking to Transport for London, what they will tell you is before the current lockdown, only school children and blue-collar workers were using public transport, not a single person in a suit. We have to recognise that that is the economic reality and the current disparities in our global city. We also have to remember that central London provides and continues to provide a significant level of employment and is the engine of the country. And it requires and thrives on a culture of networking, long lunches and everything else that comes with having those really important sectors in the town. If the prevailing culture within those large institutions is that actually we want to go back to where we were before, you are never, ever going to get the 15 neighbourhood work to actually happen on the ground. So really what we must do is recognise that this is about spending locally, and that's much more important rather than the redistribution of labour and where we work. It's not really about where you earn your money, it's about making sure you spend it locally. In terms of housing, and I won't dwell on this because I know Danny's going to pick this up in terms of planning reform, but it is absolutely critical that if we are to make 15-minute neighbourhoods a reality, then we need to absolutely look at new models for financing housing and how do you achieve mixed tenure. Otherwise, what we will do is simply replicate the existing disparities in the housing markets that we are all well aware of. Caring. Closer proximity could mean better integrated approaches to how we care for our elderly and our young, but we cannot escape the fact that we need to think about how we fund these services. Every consecutive government of every colour has not faced up to the significant gap in funding for social care. Let's also not forget that it is women who have continued to work through this pandemic to do the bulk of caring, domestic, paid work and homeschooling. Would 15-minute neighbourhoods make those jobs even harder as multiple demands continue but just become closer? Caring is also a woman's profession, which is underpaid and undervalued. How does 15 neighbourhoods take that fundamental change in the market, and how do we do that? I think that's a massive challenge. Supplying. We all know, and it's well publicised, that the pandemic has exposed some efficient global supply chains that simply did not deliver. Be that PPE or the national distribution set up for medical and vaccination logistics, it just didn't work. And local networks and local was much better. We gained real flexibility and real social value. Many authorities, councils up and down this country overnight stood up large logistical distribution networks, something we're not in the business of, but because we knew our communities, we were able to do that. That is a real benefit of a 15-minute neighbourhood. However, as consumers, we must also remember that other supply chains worked fantastically and have made millions off the back of this, Amazon being a prime example. It has worked so brilliantly. And as consumers, let's be really honest, are we really going to move away from that? What does this mean about spending power locally? And I think that's a question for us all, because my children say every day, Mummy, how much more money have we put into Bezos's pockets? Every single one of us, I guarantee on this call today, has used Amazon for Christmas. It's just too easy. What does that mean in terms of local supply chains and really doing stuff in neighbourhoods? Finally, learning. Online learning and training is here to stay. But how do we pivot our universities and our HE and FE colleges to change and catch up with this? 15-minute neighbourhoods should really provide new and better ways in which we learn, reskill, and hopefully take part in our communities. Finally, enjoying. I visited the Museum of Childhood in Bethnal Green earlier this year, probably I think in February, before this whole thing started. And I was struck and took a photo of a quote that a German philosopher said, where he simply said, "In every real man, a child is hidden that wants to play." The role of culture, creative activities, and our public spaces in our lives has never been more important. Whether we were allowed out or whether we weren't, these were fundamental things that make a neighbourhood thrive. And having places where enjoyment is the primary role is a real shift in the British mindset. All these concepts of caring, enjoying, living, working, and supplying are something we can all relate to in this room. And however, in designing them and thinking about them, we must also absolutely recognise that not everyone and everywhere has the luxury to think or live like we do. I was struck recently by some research into unemployment rates in the hospitality sector in central London. And it was talking about restaurants, and it was saying there's lots of young white males around the age of 20 to 25 that are sadly being made unemployed in those sectors. One hopes that with their life ahead and lots more training, they'll be able to divert their skills and go into another industry or get another job. However, that industry of restaurants has predominantly got Bengali men working in it, who tend to be in their 50s and 60s, who are going to find it much more tougher to get another job in a neighbourhood. So what does that mean to him? For every one job in my borough at the moment, I've got 4 people chasing it. What does that mean when we start to think about 15-minute neighbourhoods? How do you give people genuine jobs in this new way? I'd like to end by briefly talking about 15-minute neighbourhoods, but in a real microcosm. For the past 3 years, I've been working on a large estate regeneration project, which seeks to provide over 2,000 new homes, including more council homes, new green spaces, private outdoor space for every single household, as well as new community facilities, commercial space, and hopefully some health facilities. All of these are ingredients of a 15-minute neighbourhood, but at a really hyper-local level. But this really isn't a housing project. What we are trying to do here is to increase life expectancy, reduce long-term health illness, improve educational attainments for those children and their children, and improve people's quality of life. This is what I think 15-minute neighbourhoods should focus on, rather than thinking just about planning and policy. We must think about the problems we are trying to resolve. And therefore, in conclusion, we must not just react and think, oh, 15-minute neighbourhoods is the next best thing, because it feels like we're trying to be saviours of a place, where actually, quite simply, the city and our neighbourhoods will continue as they have to evolve and develop. However, the one thing that is undeniable about this pandemic is that it has brought us quite simply closer to home. That will leave a lasting legacy as we think about placemaking and what it means to be safe and secure and to be a good neighbour and citizen. Thank you.
Thank you, Naz. That was brilliant, actually. It was really good. The thing is, you've covered so many things and so many issues that a lot of challenges, some of the opportunities. There's been a few questions on here. Actually, one of them has actually got to do about, what you're doing at Kingston is absolutely is great. But what do you think about other boroughs? What's happening else in London? Some of, like in a lot of places, some organisations are better than doing things than other things.
I've been fortunate enough to be working alongside the GLA, the mayor, and all the local authorities in London, along with the business sector, to look at what the impacts of this pandemic have been and what our economic recovery might look like. And I talked there very briefly about the central activity zone. The centre of London, which is essentially the engine of the country, has been obliterated overnight. Everybody has gone home to work. That means there are no tourists coming to this country that absolutely prop up the economy in London. Our restaurants, our theatres, our community volunteer sector, our supply chain, the nighttime has just gone overnight. And whilst there are lots of conversations about outer London might benefit from central London activity moving out, quite frankly, we need each other. We need central London to be thriving and economically prosperous, because that benefits people in outer London and the wider economy. And the conversations we are having at the London level at the moment is, how do we develop a collective narrative in a post-Brexit world about what London can only uniquely do that can ensure that we get the right voices in central government heard? And that's going to take some time. So I wouldn't want to talk about an organisation. I think we are all facing significant challenges. And I think collectively, our conversations, both with central government and more widely, is about how do we keep London competitive as a coherent city, a global city, when we have just come out of Europe and when we are facing our deepest recession ever. And I don't think anybody has the answers, but I think it's about a collective effort to look at what we need to do together.
Okay, great. Can I ask you another question? Because you talked about because there's another question came from Frances Sweet about, you know, the caring element. And she's been asking, what about paying carer relatives as a mean of boosting supply of carers and spending locally?
I'm sorry, paying carers?
Yeah, paying carers. So, you know, people are looking after their families in order to actually get some money to spend locally. I mean, what's your views about actually paying carers?
Thank you for the question. I am not a adult social care or health expert, so unfortunately I don't know the ins and outs of it. I think it's recognised in this country. I think a number of things that the pandemic has brought to our fore is, first, our carers are underpaid and under-recognised. As a caring profession, if I talk to my colleagues in adult social care and I talk to people that are working in care homes, they are on zero-based contracts. They are not getting paid the minimum wages. This is a national issue, which comes back to the underfunding of adult social care as a profession. And I just think paying carers is part of the solution. I wouldn't say it's going to fundamentally change the way in which we fund adult social care. And that is the big elephant in the room. Thank you.
Okay, all right. Maybe a bit not exactly what we were going to be doing. Tom, I think I'm going to go over to you now. Tom is going to talk to us about what Sovereign Housing Association is thinking about. I think it's good.
So can you see my presentation? Okay, well, second time lucky. I mean, when I was asked to do this, I thought, well, actually, I better stop for a minute and think about what I really knew about what those 15-minute concept was. And basically, the vision is for a sustainable city that imagines places where residents can truly live locally with everything they need, just a short walk or bike ride away. And I guess what I'm going to be doing in this presentation is asking how realistic that is, and how that relates to what practice actually is at the moment, and particularly what housing associations can do. Now, one of the things I knew about the 15-minute city was that it was big in Paris, that basically there was a lot of work happening there, that essentially it was, but to a large extent, there were so many questions that came out of the work that was happening in Paris for me around ideas of, you know, was this whole thing around a middle class change in the way that Naz has talked about, in terms of, if you live in London and there is a rush hour, which is a construction rush hour in the morning on public transport. And was this whole thing about 15-minute cities really about the historic parts of cities and making them much more attractive for the people that already live there? And in a sense, you know, I therefore had to ask myself some questions. You know, in a sense, some of the ideas around the 15-minute city, around connectivity, around walkability, etc., they're not new, but as a concept, is it still worthwhile? How does it relate to what we've been doing in the UK over the last 10, 20 years? Density is one of the key elements that comes out of the 15-minute city. And I really wanted to understand for myself whether this related to the kind of denser arguments, where in London, increasingly, what we once thought of, as dense of 100 units per hectare now isn't dense at all. It's actually 240 or something like that. So does this relate to that in the same way? Does it point to us having got stuff wrong, in what we've been doing? Will it help us to get stuff more right? And does COVID really change everything? And then really to turn around to what are the limits and what we can do as housing associations, because I work for a housing association. What's my role in this? What can we make happen? And the answers on a postcard for me are this. No, it's not new, or the various parts of it are not new, but actually it's really worthwhile because it challenges practice and pulls things back to basics. I think in the UK, there's been quite a significant amount of thinking and practice, which has been useful and relates to this concept of the 15-minute city. So I think some of the initial urban renaissance stuff, I think the Prince's Trust around, this idea about walkability and design codes, you may not like Poundbury, but some of the ideas that are there are well worth, replicating. Some regeneration schemes, I think it's really interesting about when you look at the analysis of high density schemes, those which are seen to work better as places are actually the regeneration schemes, not the new purpose-built high density blocks. And this whole idea of mixed income, mixed tenure, this idea of equity of place, that actually different people with different backgrounds can actually live in those places. And I think that's really important. And the thing for me that I found interesting around the 15-minute city is this concept of the complete neighbourhood and equity. And I think Naz has talked about this idea of the complete neighbourhood, what it can do, what it's actually delivering, which is over and above simply thinking about the urban form. And that relates very much to this concept of equity. And I've got a slide a bit about those in a moment. And then the other issue, have we got things wrong? And I think there's something about the analysis which is now coming out about the super dense schemes that we have in London and about how they are, that actually shows and why people live in them. And in essence, the primary reason why, and something like 70% of people are in 40 and below, most are single, childless couples that in those purpose-built blocks. The main reason why they want to live with them is the speed of transport to somewhere else. And has that changed? And I think that's the real key issue for us. And so, are we so used to thinking zonally about accommodation that actually there's so much in the psyche of the country that has got to change? And I think one of the things with COVID, it may not have changed things quite as fundamental as we do, but what it has done is made people realize that even if they're 15 minutes from a park and they have to cross two main roads to get there, it's very different from being in a place which has got green space as integral to where you are. And I think there's a key thing that comes out of the 15-minute concept, which is this idea of replication and not extension. And I think that's reflected. This is really important for small towns as well as for cities. The idea that rather than you just have a linear extension where you stick housings, etc., is that you try and recreate a sense of neighbourhood by having a new heart of a place. And actually you replicate rather than simply extend, so that you've got linear extension. And that's a real mindset change, I think, for a lot of authorities. And then I think, has COVID changed things fundamentally? I'm not sure. I do think that the customer will be more demanding around what the place is like. I think that will be a change in terms of when looking at when people begin to look at a potential new home. And I think people will stop seeing it so much as accommodation as a home. So what can we do as housing associations? So I'm afraid I've got more postcards to answer that. So really quickly, this is from, I won't leave it up there if the slides are available. This is from the Portland Plan. Really interesting about an American city where the geography curtails expansion. Therefore, it's looking inward and thinking about what it can do. And this is really about this idea that I think Nazeya has talked about, which is around the complete neighbourhood. It's not simply about the urban design, it's about shops, quality, education, open spaces, civic communities generally. And what they did in the Portland process was think about this. And this is what I really like, that bit about equity, thinking about the equity of place all the time. What is it that happens in a place that makes people's, gives, in a sense, it's a form of equal opportunity. So the place itself is a springboard for a variety of different people, different ages, different origins, you know, different classes, etc. And I think if we can take the idea of the 15-minute neighbourhood and keep it democratic, I think it's a really successful thing to do. So how does that impact on what we do? Well, this is where we work. You can see we work from outside. We like to say we're the largest housing association working in the south outside of London. And you see we go right up to the edges of London, and we'll do more and more so. But what that gives us is we've got cities, we've got towns, we've got villages, we've got a whole variety of settlements where we can actually think about applying these concepts. And so, you know, I think what we can do is there's many impediments. And I think later we'll talk about some of these impediments in terms of planning, in terms of viability of schemes. But housing associations are long-term organisations. They should think long-term and take commensurate risk. We should be place shapers, placemakers, and be patient, but we should think big and small. I'm happy to do 6 homes in a village as well as do 2,000 homes, you know, on a new settlement. I think there's something about strategic asset management. We're talking about regeneration in London, but that's true across this geography. How successful are those places? How do they work? And housing associations have to be genuinely strategic, and we should lose our financial muscle to be land-led. We should apply principles to towns and villages, town centre, and we should, as housing associations, if we have really good estates and neighbourhoods, but the towns themselves are suffering, we need to participate in town centre regeneration. It's part of the equity of offer to our customers. So I'm just going to finish quickly. We've spent around about the last 12 months, a bit longer now, creating what we call the Homes and Place Standard and the Homes and Place Assessment Tool. And we've co-created this with our residents and with across all the disciplines within our organisation. And now every new development and every existing development will be tested against this so that we can actually see whether we think the places we've got, so it's about sustainability, it's about the homes, how the homes work, but actually how the places themselves work in terms of those concepts of equity, to test everything to see whether we think that every new development passes, or whether if it doesn't, what can we do to improve it. And these are some outcomes. You're seeing them early. We're not launching them for another 6 weeks within the organisation. But the thing is, it's about looking all the time. But as I say, not only at new developments, but existing developments, and how new developments can link in with existing developments to create a very different form of space. And I think that housing associations have to be active in doing that. And the very last thing, people may have read in the paper, we bought a shopping centre recently. Actually, we bought lots of stuff. Why this one got into the papers, I don't know. We bought a shopping centre on the basis that we believe that the retail offer that is made in that shopping centre is going to have to change. And it's in Clifton, which is the most wealthy part, or the second most wealthy part of Bristol, where huge amounts of key workers work, but they don't live in that area. We saw this as an opportunity to redevelop a shopping centre to provide a new neighbourhood focus and create a new retail offer, but more importantly, to provide affordable housing in a successful neighbourhood where the amount of affordable housing was very limited indeed. And that's an issue about thinking longer term to create equity within a place. So that's I will stop there, Maggie. Thank you.
Unmute myself. Thanks very much. I've actually been shopping there. I just realised in that shopping centre. That was really interesting, and it's important to see how Sovereign is actually taking this on board. There's a question here from Rebecca Dillon Robinson, and because you've talked about the importance of equity, but she's asking, how do we ensure that community engagement in this concept have actually got buy-in into the 15-minute neighbourhood? Now, because it's also got a lot to do with behaviour change, you know. Is there a way to better involve the communities in the evolution of the idea?
Well, one of the reasons why I talked about regeneration is that what I found interesting when looking at a recent analysis of the larger schemes, that the ones which were based on regeneration, where there was an existing community which was involved in shaping the place and remained behind, generally seemed to be getting a better press and had more sustainable education and amenity offer, really. Partly because I think that they've been shaped, but by necessity, you have to take account of that, of the communities that's there. I think it's really difficult. I mean, one of the reasons why we created our sustainability, we co-created it along with residents, was we're not necessarily in new places going to have the residents there to start talking about. But what we will do in places like Clifton Down, we've already begun to talk to local community groups. What things will happen? We will plan that redevelopment alongside a very significant community consultation process. So that, but one of the key things for me is that we still need to be delivering affordable homes there. So there's some non-negotiables and some negotiables around how the built form and what the retail offer is going to be into the future.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, from my own past work with regeneration, that's really important that you touch on all of those things. It's important. I wanted to ask also about, we talked about, Naz mentioned the people traveling on the public transport, are all kind of blue collar workers. And a lot of the work that housing associations does, you need maintenance people and cleaners and etc. How do they benefit from the 15-minute neighbourhood?
Well,
given they have to do a lot of travelling.
Well, I think that's a really interesting point. We have about 2,000 employees. Half of those are blue-collar workers or care workers or whatever. And actually, they're still working through. They continue to work. We reduce the service that we give, but people continue to work to provide maintenance, etc. And they're van-based. And we employ people, around kind of general geographical areas, but they still have to move around. And I think there's a massive issue around transport and about the reality of transport and the reality about who can work from home. And I do think that's difficult. This is why I don't think it's for everybody. It's great for a concept of those people that are able to work from home and are office based and they can go in for a period of time and maintain links. And incidentally, I happen to be in charge of workplace as well, so I'm thinking through the future office estate and thinking through how people are going to work, and the reduction of that is fine. But it's very different idea when we're actually talking about the people in the vans, and we can improve things through technology, but you don't change it. You can't change it fundamentally. There's another issue about transport, which is also this idea that what we've done is invested in kind of rapid transit to satellite towns outside of London. And in doing so, we create a kind of dynamic around station, a form of high density housing around stations, which is very similar to what happens in London, or a kind of suburban sleep pattern outside of those towns where people drive in to the station to get into central London very quickly. And I think that is one of the things. I think if we talk about stuff that we haven't quite got right, I think that's one of those things. So we have to really start thinking about those satellite towns in a different way in terms of how we create them as replicated neighbourhoods or replicated towns, as opposed to simply dormitories where people commute into the centre.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tom. Okay, we're going to now a lot of these concepts always come down to money. We were just talking about, when we were having a pre-meeting, about all the things we want to do in terms of affordable housing, etc. But it often comes down to money and viability. So Danny, I'm going to go over to you now, and Danny's going to talk to us a bit about what the issues are for property development and planning.
Thank you, Maggie, and hello to everybody. I'm going to just quickly touch upon the 15-minute neighbourhood and some themes from that, some macro trends, then move on to property planning, policy, role for local authorities, and then sum up. So Thank you. So, I mean, as has been said, the 15-minute neighbourhood is not necessarily a new idea as such. In fact, if we go back to the origins of the Garden City movement, a lot of principles of that, the importance of locality, accessibility, walkability, are embedded in the Garden City principles. But as Tom has also said, that in fact, you know, that it would appear that there could be argued that there is an advantage for pre-existing higher density locations to make a success of the 15-minute city. And arguably, cities such as Paris, Milan, Barcelona have an advantage because that was their inherent growth pattern and urban form. But we go back to the late 90s and the introduction of towards an urban renaissance. We've arguably been on that pathway in London, and the correct reintroduction of a strategic London plan, a London mayor. We've been on that journey towards densification, intensification. So themes of the 15-minute neighbourhood have been embedded, rightly or wrongly in some ways, or correctly, incorrectly in other ways, into our planning system. So there is a recurring theme here in terms of creating sustainable communities. And as Naz very clearly and eloquently pointed out, the synergy of those criteria are really important that work beyond planning. So there are good examples that we could point to. Tom mentioned Poundbury and the principles from the Prince's Foundation, the Prince's Trust, and of suburban or edge of town growth, picking up on that theme of replicability as opposed to extension. So moving on to the macro trends. Now, actually, clearly COVID-19 is so present and prescient and impactful on how things are. But I think we have to look beyond COVID-19. Clearly, there is a fundamental impact of COVID-19, but looking beyond, fingers crossed, and hopefully there is a beyond that within months from now. There are other macro trends which have been at play and are still at play. The macro trend post-Brexit of global Britain, of national levelling up, of the fundamental challenge of buying your goods online rather than going to your high street, of changes in working patterns which were there prior to COVID-19, which have been accelerated arguably by COVID-19. The growing focus on climate change and zero carbon, and that becoming much deeper in the zeitgeist and the thought processes of policymakers and consumers. The decline and challenge of the high street. We know also that we have a huge national debt which is going to need some kind of addressing, and then that might mean that taxation in various different forms, increases in taxation, are on their way. Naz mentioned the gaps in provision for social care in the ageing population. The growing discussions around food miles, food production actually being closer to home. I've mentioned also already urban form of growth, but one thing we have to always remember, and actually a lot of, if we focus on the post-war planning period, rightly or wrongly, in many ways perhaps unfortunately, our towns and cities have been shaped and directed by the primacy of the car, and arguably that's a fundamental challenge that we need to think about and address in order to think beyond and introduce more sustainable living in neighbourhoods. So on to property. Actually, there's many different impacts on property in terms of how it's affected cities, towns, neighbourhoods, and so on. Two key fundamental issues that we have in front of us. One is the potential reuse of office space and commercial space and retail space. That's a huge challenge. There are, I'm sure there are, and there will be plenty of property owners in the centre of London, in the outer suburbs and towns that will be thinking, what are we going to do with our space? Is this, you know, how are we going to deal with this opportunity? There are occupiers who will be thinking, and Tom mentioned about the office estate of Sovereign Housing Association. There are many occupiers who will be thinking, what do we need this space? We can actually have a hub rather than so much office space. So there is actually, despite the challenge, a huge potential opportunity here of reusing and refashioning property space. There are other property issues that we're, you know, big property issues that we in the industry and housing are dealing with, including the post-Grenfell agenda, zero carbon. There's a fundamental problem in housing supply and affordable housing supply. I think we need to move away from over-relying on planning game. We'll come back to that, because actually the core is fundamental long-term investment, public investment, including institutional investment as one of those additional routes into affordable housing. And then looking at how that affects planning policy. So if we had to mark the white paper out of 10, you know, can it help? I'm afraid to say, in my opinion, I think the white paper only gets 1.5 to 2 out of 10. So it does raise some very important points, which actually are critical in terms of moving forward on how we deliver planning services and deliver strategic planning and so on. Digitization of the planning system, great. Removing uncertainty in the planning system as best you can, great. Ambiguity around zoning, too much ambiguity, too many unintended consequences, and a fundamental ambiguity about how the planning gain and infrastructure aspects of the white paper will work. Some recent changes in the use classes are potentially good to pick up on, I think picking up on Naz's point about moving from zoning to a mosaic approach. Arguably, use class dexterity does allow for bottom-up change and flexibility for reuse of property in centres, and some change in permitted development rights recently has gone a little bit in the right direction, but fundamentally not enough. So we could be looking for further changes there. In fact, I think we should be looking for further changes there. So moving forward, we do need to think beyond COVID-19. We need to just not forget those macro forces and challenges, but we're not in control of them. One of the opportunities is for local authorities, and again, they've been doing it, many of them have been doing it, but local authorities re-looking, and housing associations, re-looking at their strategic asset management approach, which is exactly what Tom mentioned earlier, looking at land and assets and going beyond, as far as at all possible, going beyond the one public estate concept and mindset, where public sector landowners and others who are minded to work in partnership actually join forces and look at the adjacencies of their property estate and say, what can we do together, make a financial return, but actually putting our assets together, there's much more to be delivered and gained with a greater social value dimension. So one thing that central government could do is to help in that shift, encourage that shift, and allow local authorities more dexterity in what comes under the definition of best value, to introduce socio-economic measures and dexterity. Another thing that central government potentially could do is to level up the definition of arguably planning viability definition and the definitions of CPO, so that CPO removes hope value, there is compensatory value, there is added value, but it removes hope value from certain aspects of the definition of CPO to encourage and drive more civic, I think this has been used recently, civic and municipal entrepreneurialism, a greater role for the local authority to use the tools it could have, better tools to drive that holistic approach, not just the planning approach, but joining up the dots and encouraging bottom-up involvement of communities and organisations and businesses and so on. In the short term, I would say if permitted development rights are here to stay, and there's lots to be, that could be the subject of another webinar, then in the short term, a cash levy, a contribution of some form from central government policy change saying there is a cash levy towards affordable housing from permitted development rights schemes, not necessarily to undermine the delivery of such projects, definitely improve the quality of those projects by additional regulation, but some form of cash contribution where they don't currently make a cash contribution. One of the key things is also about local authority resources. This goes back to the planning white paper, actually empowering local authorities with the skills and staff to be able to deliver services. I'm going to leave it at that because I think I'm just about at time, and I'm sure there's a lot of questions.
Thanks very much, Danny. Actually, funny if I'm going to actually ask Naz a question. If you've got all this extra money, cash levy, how could you use that in terms of contributing to, you know, the ideas of the 15-minute neighbourhood?
So I think just to pick up a couple of points that Danny's made, I think, and it's been great to hear somebody advocating for more funding for local government. I think we are the 5th emergency service, but one that's never ever highlighted. And yeah, I think it is really important. I think in terms of, you know, local government's finances have been hit quite significantly through the economic challenge that the pandemic has faced. Not only has the demand gone up in terms of services and what we're having to do, but actually we've lost all our income. If you think about business rates, you think about parking, all of those revenues that help us deliver essential services have now pretty much disappeared, and we're in real challenging times. In terms of kind of the, you know, how can councils use this funding? I mean, I think we are already seeing, and certainly my own authority is really stepping up and recognising that, like, after every recession and every fall in the property market, it is public funding and public sector that reinvigorate the housing market. So in my own authority, we have made some quite significant announcements recently in investing both in our leisure facilities, but also into remodelling and reshaping our town centre. And I think in terms of the white paper, I do agree with some of the sentiments, but there is also an increase in engaging residents really early in the local plan making process that I think is really important. And I think, you know, again, we could talk at great length about the property market and what's going to happen. But I think as a local authority, it is about really using your assets wisely, rationalising your assets. We have made some really quite significant announcements, again, around what we might do around our office estate, a bit like you, Tom. We're really thinking about where do we need to work and who needs to be on the front end. Our social workers, our caretakers, they need somewhere to be. But actually, people like myself don't actually need to be sat in a very expensive, costly office in the middle of Kingston. So it's about how do we connect with our communities in different ways. Also, in our borough, many people are digitally enabled. They've got high levels of skills, and actually, quite frankly, I've seen better levels of engagement online than I have seen in a very long time when it comes to engagement on schemes or whether it's the democratic process. So I think the pandemic gives us opportunities as well as challenges. And I think you will see out of this, I think actually the public sector pivoting much more in a much more agile way than I think you'll see the private sector. So that's my very long-winded response. Thanks.
Okay. So we've got another question here from Morgan Thackrell, who's asking about having really mixed intergenerational communities. Because, I mean, you have this whole thing about everyone is going to be cycling, and I can imagine some people might not feel that comfortable with all the cycling that's going around after a certain age, or possibly, I know there are lots of older cyclists. But is there anything, the question is, how do you have a truly mixed intergenerational community when the housing needs of older families, individuals, are not being updated? And that most people actually don't want sheltered accommodation, and there are quite a few active people or older, post 65 or 75, that need to downsize, but there are not necessarily the homes to be able to downsize into. So what's your approach, Tom? I mean, what have you been doing? Have you thought about it in terms of your existing stock?
I mean, as it turns out, I chaired a working party at the Housing Forum into what the housing offer for older people should be. And I guess to anticipate some of that, which it launches on Friday, is that I think that the plea from that working party was for people, in a sense, to take account in terms of, particularly in things like strategic asset management, what Naz is talking about in terms of looking again at, and Danny's talked about in terms of looking again at the current estate and when we do regeneration. Look at that in terms of actually the real positives that there are in terms of mixed communities, genuinely kind of, and age is a really key part of that. And if you get the housing right, the ability to have informal and formal support as opposed to care really is raised quite significantly. But you need to make sure that your offer of housing is the right offer of housing. So they did an exercise at Hyde Housing Association where they talked to all their older residents and discovered that the amount of cross-generational living that was actually happening within people. So everybody's saying, well, they've got a 3-bedroom flat, they've got a 4-bedroom house, let's get them moved. But actually, when you looked at it, there was a need not for a 1-bedroom, but for a 2-bedroom. And you really got to start to think around what is appetite and understand the demography and understand the demand. And the other side of it is this thing is about, as we all get older, it happens to us all, I'm afraid, that you know, this idea that people, I mean, what is it? 1 in 4 by, I don't know, 2040 or something. 1 in 4 of us is going to be over 65. I mean, you know, that's not a subgroup. That's kind of like a major group. So we just need to get this sorted out. We just need to make sure that the offer is appetite for a range of different people. And there's no absence of ideas about how to do this. There's no absence of design ideas. And again, I think it's something that we all have to take account of as we move forward into regeneration and redevelopment and new communities.
Okay. Alba, can I ask you, actually, from the studies that you've got about intergenerational work, has that come up in any of the things in other places? And there's also a question at the very, very beginning that Brendan Southfield was asking. So I'm going to give you two questions. Everyone talks about Paris. What is happening in other places? Is Paris really the best place for working on 15-minute neighbourhood? So if you can answer those two issues.
So, I mean, the first one was about the generational, how that impact and what we have seen in our studies, right? Yeah. So in terms of generational, in terms of working from home, we've seen that young people generally could prefer to go to the office, at least like for part of the time, because they really value socializing or even just the learning experience. So if you see other ages, they prefer to stay at home. So in that way, we've seen that, I mean, workplace, if they want to attract that people or make them go more to the office, they obviously need to change something, you know? So in terms of working from home, obviously, if you go to the younger ages, they prefer to go more often to the office. So the percentage could be less, let's say, in terms of working from home. Then the second question, sorry, Maggie.
Actually, you know, everyone talks about Paris as the example for the best 15-minute neighborhood. I know they've just announced plans for the Champs-Élysées. They're going to change everything. But what about other cities?
I mean, I think there's a lot of hype around Paris because it's like the latest one, and it came just during the COVID with the elections in Paris. But you have several other examples. So for instance, in Australia, I think Melbourne have also this, I think it's 20-minute neighborhood plan that is pretty good. And other cities have these concepts already implemented. The thing is that they don't call it that way. But I think that there are, I mean, several cities, especially across Europe, because I think that is easy, it's more, let's say, it's easier just to implement it. But I mean, I think that Paris is, I mean, couldn't be the best example, let's say, that we can look somewhere else.
Okay, all right. Okay, listen, I think we've more or less come to the end. I know there's some still questions and we haven't been able to answer all of them, but I hope we've managed to cover a lot of the issues. So it's in some ways, with all the challenges, is actually quite an exciting time for the way that we can actually rethink about what we're doing. How do we actually make best use of the space that we're living in, and to have a better quality of life for everybody, not just the comfortable middle class. I wanted to thank you very much for joining us today, and I would just say very big thanks to Albert and to Naz, Tom and Danny, and safe journeys everybody. Thank you.